Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News. Along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS, we are in the JNS Media Hub. Good to have you back. Alex, let's start with the top story this week. The war in Gaza can possibly restart, according to reports received over the weekend. Jerusalem possibly planning to resume the war in 4 to 6 weeks in a decisive campaign to wipe out Hamas. This, according to reports on Friday. The plan to conquer the entire Gaza Strip in one fell swoop with more than 50,000 soldiers. Here we are, Alex, the end of phase one of the ceasefire. It looks perhaps that Israel may, in fact, go back to war in Gaza.
Well, certainly it's been Netanyahu's tactic to threaten major military force in order to get what he wants, which is the hostages out. Now, there's people in Israel calling for Israel to take the entirety of the Gaza Strip. There's a lot of people in Israel don't understand why Israel has been giving Hamas exactly what they want in order to get back the hostages. I mean, there was a story on JNS just this week with Professor Robert Oman, the Nobel Prize laureate in game theory, who said that Israel should be willing to trade one prisoner for one hostage and nothing more, and then everything else is just games. Now, Israel is basically saying that if Hamas does not agree to what they call Witkoff's new plan, which would call for a 42-day ceasefire through the entirety of Ramadan, through the entirety of Passover, in which half of the living hostages, we're talking about 26 living hostages, given back at the beginning and half given at the end, that if Hamas doesn't agree to that, then they're going to be launching an all-out strike on the entirety of the Gaza Strip. Now, there's a few things here I don't really understand. President Trump said there's all help to break loose if all the prisoners are not returned. So I understand they did negotiate this phase one at the very beginning, right before Trump got into office. Trump wanted a win. Witkoff came. This was the old formula prescribed by the Biden administration, so they went for that. Okay, but Trump has changed the rules of the game. He said if all the hostages are not back by a Saturday, which was, I think, about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, that, you know, the ceasefire would be over. Now, I understand why Netanyahu waited, because he wanted to get back the hostages according to that deal. And by all accounts, Israel got what they wanted in that phase one. But phase one's now over, right? Hamas is saying, well, let's go to phase two. Israel's saying we're not going to phase two. The Trump administration is saying we're not going to phase two the way the Biden administration had drawn it up. So Israel's in a position where they could say the rules of the game have changed. You give us all the hostages back tomorrow, or we're going with this campaign, right?
But that's not what happened. Over the weekend, Israel even still had a team on the ground in Cairo, and the prime minister said that we were willing to extend the ceasefire. Hamas came out and said that they're rejecting an extension to the ceasefire. Netanyahu called the team back home, and here we are now. It appears that phase one is now officially done, and what happens next in terms of a phase two remains to be seen. Will we head towards a phase two, or will we go back to war?
Right, this is the big question. And as you said, Israel's called up now something like 400,000 troops, preparing to put 50,000 troops in. Now, the question is, you know, what are they going to do in this second go-round, the second offensive that they weren't able to do in the first offensive? Why aren't they doing that if they want to do it? Now, I understand you want to get the hostages back. So, but why does it have to be over a period of 6 weeks with a ceasefire? Now, Israel's also said, in addition to the preparations for a major military offensive, that they're going to stop sending or allowing any humanitarian aid to enter to the Strip. Well, that's something that Israel could have and should have done at the beginning, right? Maybe all the hostages would have been back if Israel would have denied humanitarian aid from going into the Strip. Now, at this point, Israel also believes that there's so much humanitarian aid that's been delivered into the Strip that Hamas and Gaza could survive several weeks without humanitarian aid. There's just that much that's been delivered into there. So how much of a threat really is that? Because they're also saying that they're not going to turn off the electricity. They're not going to turn off the water. So basically they're saying, look, we're going to pause humanitarian aid right now if you don't give us back our hostages. It's not that strong of a threat. And the question is, another question, if Israel would get the hostages back. Some kind of phase 1 extension, some new phase 2, whatever it looks like, does get negotiated. Is this what Israel is going to do on the backside of that as well? Right. So there's a lot cooking here. And I really think that the next week or 2 weeks is going to be very, very important in defining what the next phases of this war looks like in Gaza, also vis-a-vis Iran. I think that if Israel gets to another 6 weeks of ceasefire, I think it becomes very, very difficult for them to get back into the Gaza Strip at the end of that.
I saw the images coming out of Gaza last night. You know, we're in the holiday month of Ramadan, and the Muslim Arabs there breaking their fast, having the iftar ceremony. There's plenty of food in Gaza. They have gotten plenty of humanitarian aid. All those claims of a humanitarian crisis, the claims of not having enough food are absolutely false. So, you know, regardless of the fact that humanitarian aid from this morning is not going into Gaza, they certainly have enough food and water to get by. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Also, Israel making all kind of preparations now vis-a-vis Ramadan. It sounds as though they don't want to fight over Ramadan because they're afraid that that could irritate the rest of the population inside Israel and Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. You know, that's not a way to play the negotiations game. If you're not willing to fight your enemy when they're at their most radical, then you have a problem. Like, you have to be willing to fight. We have to see what Netanyahu is going to do here. Perhaps, once again, he's calling Hamas's bluff. Maybe he really believes that they're not going to agree to Witkoff's proposal, and he really is preparing to send the IDF back in. I mean, I think if they do, we're talking about something where Netanyahu and the team have said it would be a 6-month maximum operation. But that's basically taking Israel back into war.
Let's make no mistake about it. Hamas is still Hamas. Okay, at the end of the day, ceasefire, no ceasefire. And again, Hamas, the terrorist organization, releasing a video over the weekend of hostage Eitan Horn, an Israeli who was abducted during the October 7th, 2023 massacre during the invasion of northwestern Gaza. So again, another propaganda video. We've seen many of these come out. Another one coming out over the weekend. Hamas still proving exactly who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they're running out of cards. And I know that people are saying here that Hamas is getting stronger. I think that the amount of strength that they're gaining is really superficial. Yes, are they recruiting more people that don't have homes to join their ranks? Potentially. But I think there's still a limited number of guns inside the Gaza Strip. There's certainly a limited number of rockets. Obviously, whoever's being recruited now doesn't have the same kind of training that the original forces had given. And even though you see sometimes in these ceremonies, which I think you're not going to see any more of these ceremonies,
right.
But in those ceremonies, you saw, several hundred Hamas members at these ceremonies, and it's made to look like Hamas is strong. I think that we're actually seeing that Hamas is really on the ropes, but because they hide out among the entirety of the Gaza Strip from top to bottom, and they hide in civilian infrastructure, and they have tunnels still underneath, it's going to be a difficult operation to root them all out. It's hard to find them. And that's why it's going to take so many troops. But here it does look like Israel preparing an overwhelming use of force in terms of manpower, and is willing to go, from the top to the bottom of the strip, moving people again out of the north back into humanitarian zones. But then the question is, why did Israel give that up to begin with, right? Why didn't they go all the way when they were inside Gaza? And then that takes you back to the Biden administration. There are new rules in the game. There's a new sheriff in town in terms of President Trump, and we've seen that he's on Israel's side here. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, and that he's definitely willing to allow Israel to go the distance, but I think that Israel shouldn't be talking about some kind of 6-week period. It should be all the hostages back now or else.
Speaking of Trump and the hostages, Israeli hostage Eli Sharabi, who was released from captivity recently, he is going to be headed to Washington to meet with President Donald Trump this week.
With several other freed hostages.
Yes, exactly. So you see some of the love from President Trump getting ready to meet with some of the hostages here this week in Washington, D.C.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's important. It's important to demonstrate, for President Trump to demonstrate that he's aligned with the plight of the hostages, that he understands that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I think it's another signal to Hamas that they really had better watch their next move and choose their next move very carefully.
And sticking on the topic of the hostages, earlier in the week, the remains of 4 Israeli hostages were released in a prisoner swap. This, remember, was delayed. Israel held on to the prisoners there after the last ceremony, which Hamas conducted. But by the end of the week, you had the release of the bodies, unfortunately, of 4 Israelis, Tzachi Idan, Ohad Yahalomi, Itzik Elgarat, and Shlomo Mansour. They were released to the Red Cross around midnight on Wednesday for the passage into Israel. In exchange, 600 Arab prisoners, including many serving life sentences, were returned back to their homes in Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, and back into Gaza. Again, Prime Minister Netanyahu putting that, we talked about it last week, putting a delay on their release because of those just horrible, humiliating ceremonies conducted by Hamas. But at the end of the day, it did take place, the prisoner release.
And in this case, these last 4 took place without one of those ceremonies.
Right.
And I think that
in the middle of the night.
That's also a demonstration that Hamas understands that doing these ceremonies, which they thought were supposed to humiliate Israel, have actually brought a lot more pressure to bear on Hamas, have upset not only President Trump, also the rest of the Arab world, which have made all kind of statements really criticizing Hamas very strongly for doing this and saying that it's obvious that they're no longer a piece of the future because of the way they've conducted themselves. So Hamas giving up those ceremonies, a strong indication that they realize that they're on the back foot.
Over the course of this week, we also had the funeral of the Bibas family. Shiri Bibas and her 2 small children, Ariel and Kfir, took place in a private ceremony in southern Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis lined the route from the morgue in Rishon LeZion in central Israel down to the cemetery in southern Israel. And just a crazy, emotional day in this country. But it really just shows the difference between us here in Israel. We value life. We value each individual life here in the state of Israel versus Hamas, which values death. It's a death cult. People woke up very early in the morning, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and lined. It was just a human chain, hundreds of thousands of Israelis from central Israel all the way down to southern Israel to pay their last respects to the Bibas family. And the way Yarden Bibas spoke and the others spoke at the funeral, just heart-wrenching. It was this past Wednesday here in Israel.
Yeah, Josh, I think that's a really important point that you're making about the difference between the natures of the society. Remember, Israel actually offered millions of dollars as reward to Gazans that would give information about the whereabouts of hostages inside the Gaza Strip. Nobody came forward.
Not one.
Okay? Nobody came forward.
Not one.
And here, you have hundreds of thousands of people that don't know the Bibases, okay, but understand that this mother and her 2 baby children, these redheaded children, including a toddler, became the symbol of what Hamas had done, the brutality of the massacre. And because, like you said, Israelis value life, they celebrate life. They came to celebrate the life, the hardship, the suffering of this family, including Yarden, who was released as a hostage, only to find out that his wife and his 2 children were killed, right? And to support him as he tries to put his life back together. This is the nature of Israeli society. It proves the resilience of the Jewish people, the celebration of life as opposed to the celebration of death. And it's really the reason why, and maybe it seems counterintuitive, but it's the reason why Israel will win, right? And it's not only winning this battle, it's winning the battle of history, right? The Israelis and Jews, they get knocked down. We always get back up. We always celebrate life. There's always something more, to another reason to be resilient, and there's another reason to innovate, and there's another reason to make it better, and another reason to make sure that something like happened on October 7th never happens again.
It's been like this for over 3,000 years, and we're going to continue to get stronger and keep going. We could probably end the show right here on that positive note, but there's a lot more news to discuss. We talked about the ceasefire, whether there is a ceasefire, isn't a ceasefire in Gaza, but people should not be complacent, and that's because regardless of what happens in Gaza, we're still dealing with many other fronts to this war. Our defense minister, Israel Katz, on Thursday revealed that Hamas is planning large-scale attacks in Judea and Samaria. They're planning to attack IDF soldiers. This was at a conference, I believe, on Thursday. The defense minister Katz made these remarks. Bottom line is Hamas is still active. It's still the most popular group, the most popular terrorist organizations under the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria. And he has hard evidence that they are planning major attacks. We saw the failed bus bombing just several weeks ago, multiple bus bombings several weeks ago. And the communities in Judea, Samaria, and along the seam line, the lines separating Judea and Samaria from pre-1967 Israel, have to be on high alert. So it looks like the information is out there. People have to be vigilant and have to realize that regardless of what happens in Gaza, Hamas is still vibrant, they're still active, and they want to try to murder as many Jews as possible.
Just as there was organized plans in Gaza to pull off the October 7th massacre, and we might talk about that a little bit later, Katz identifying that there are plans to do the same inside Israeli territory emanating from Judea and Samaria. There may be similar plans to do so from Jerusalem, from Ramla, Lod, Haifa, Yaffo, other mixed Arab-Israeli cities. It's one thing to capture these plans. I mean, I think that that's important to demonstrate to the world that they exist. I don't think that Israel needed to capture plans in order to recognize that this is what Hamas has been planning. Okay, this is how they've been operating inside Judea and Samaria. The Palestinian Authority, which is a rival to Hamas, is really just the flip side of the same coin. They're supposed to be operating in the Palestinian Authority governed areas to prevent Hamas and other Palestinian terror groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Lions Den, others from organizing attacks. It's obvious that they're not doing that, which means that they are part of the problem alongside Hamas. But important to note that Hamas's popularity inside Judea and Samaria is as strong as ever because people see the Palestinian Authority not only as ineffective in the struggle against Israel, but also financially corrupt, right? And they see Hamas as being more of a pure organization that doesn't maybe have the widespread corruption as the Palestinian Authority, even though we are seeing in Gaza who's taking the humanitarian aid. Hamas is taking it. They're using it for themselves. And they're more true to the struggle. And what we witnessed a week ago, we talked about it on the show, absolute miracle. There could have easily been 1,000 people dead. And Israel has succeeded against Hamas in Judea and Samaria because of this policy of mowing the grass, going in whenever they see some kind of a terror organization sprout up or become active. They go in and they take care of it. Even aside from the agreements of the Oslo Accords, which means that they're not really supposed to go into Area A, they do that. They didn't mow the grass in Gaza. They just allowed it to simmer, and every few years they would go in and have some kind of operation, but they would never, cut the grass down to the ground level, right? They would just kind of deal with some things until the international community forced them to stop. After those bus bombings, Netanyahu went to Tulkarem, Katz went to Tulkarem. They both said that there was going to be massive operations in Judea and Samaria. We haven't seen that yet. Again, Ramadan just started this week, okay? This is the Islamic holy month, but an Islamic holy month means a month of killing Jews. Typically, it's a time where the security situation gets a lot more intense here in Israel. And specifically now, obviously, the Palestinian society is agitated over the war that's been raging here for 16 months plus. It's not a religion of peace when in the holy month, that's when they do the most killing, of course. Maybe Israel's trying to wait until Ramadan's over, but they shouldn't be doing that, especially if they are getting agitated now, right? And you see these plans. That's exactly the time where you need to act and to demonstrate your dominance over that society, to show that even in their most radical time, that's exactly when you're willing to take them out.
It's supposed to be a month of peace and reflection. And here you have the head of Hamas's so-called Jerusalem office talking to his people, encouraging them to go out and wage a full confrontation against the so-called occupation, essentially encouraging terror attacks here in Jerusalem.
Now, this is terror incitement.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Incitement to murder,
absolutely,
right here.
No doubt about it.
And I'm curious to know whether Israel's going to arrest Nasser al-Din. Right?
Yeah.
Are they going to do that? Are they going to go into Jerusalem at this point and say, look, you're inciting to violence in this time? you're out, right? But I don't see Israel doing that right now. They really should be taking the incitement much, much more seriously.
At the same time, let's turn to the north here. A very interesting situation in Syria over the weekend. Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Katz warning the new regime in Damascus Saturday evening to stay away from the Druze community, not to harm the Druze community. Apparently, there was some conflicts going on there, violence between members of the regime there, the new regime in Syria, and the Druze in southern Syria. And at the same time, you also had Israel striking various sites in southern Syria, with the defense minister this week saying that southern Syria cannot become like southern Lebanon. So a lot going on there to dissect in terms of the situation in Syria. And I think it's very interesting there that Israel is saying it's willing to go to bat for the Druze in a different country. We're not even talking about the Druze who live in northern Israel, saying that we are willing to go to battle, essentially, for the Druze living in Syria.
Right, that's amazing. Now, there's a lot to unwrap here. We know that Bashar Assad fell several months back by this HTS group led by somebody named al-Jawlani, who had former ties to al-Qaeda, who was backed by Erdogan and Turkey in order to take advantage of Assad's weakness and Iran's weakness and Russia's weakness inside Syria. And maybe they were just trying to take Aleppo in the north, and sure enough, they found themselves as far in as Damascus, and Assad fled to Moscow. And Jawlani, who used to dress in terrorist garb, now puts on a suit very similar to Mahmoud Abbas,
right?
Who runs the Palestinian Authority, trying to demonstrate that he's some kind of new, reformed, peace-loving Syrian national that's going to take over Syria and just wants to maintain status quo, take the country away from Assad, mission accomplished. But that's not really the case. And because they're backed by Turkey and Erdogan, Erdogan wants to see how far al-Jawlani can push towards southern Syria, how much control over the country he can possibly take. Now, Israel wants to see Jawlani and HTS and Erdogan and every other faction inside southern Syria, and in the entirety of Syria, rather, to see them weak. And we even heard reports this week that Israel was asking the United States to permit Russian military inside Syria in order to have some other kind of force that would diffuse the strength of al-Jawlani and HTS, right? And it's interesting because Israel should want, for the one hand, Russians to be far away. You don't want any other players here. You want Israel to be the only player. The fact that Israel is signaling its willingness to go to bat and protect the Druze in southern Syria, I think that this is actually extraordinarily interesting, and it's an important pivot that I think that Israel is beginning to make, where they're saying, we will protect the moderates in the region. Now, the Druze obviously have a protected status on the basis of the fact that many of the Druze community live in Israel. And the Druze in Israel and the Druze in southern Syria feel a kinship, a sense of kinship, to the extent that the Druze in southern Syria have called even for Israel to extend their sovereignty over southern Syria. And I don't know if Israel will extend its sovereignty beyond the buffer that they've already taken, which is a pretty significant piece of land, including the northern Hermon Mountain, which has panoramic strategic significance over the entirety of Syria. It's the highest point in that country and is certainly now the highest point in Israel. Protecting the Druze is exactly what Israel should be willing to do on both sides of the borders. Now, in addition to that, the Druze have tried to align themselves with the Kurds, which are just to the north, and they span all the way into Iraq, right? So what you can have here is a landmass of Israel-aligned factions here that don't really identify as the traditional Sunni Shiite Muslims. Druze are Arabs, but they're not Muslims. Kurds also have their own religious beliefs, and they don't like either the Shiites from Iran nor the Sunnis that are coming down from Turkey. And so you have the opportunity here to create this land mass that includes the Kurds, the Druze, all the way down to Israel, and it gives Israel an opportunity to operate throughout that entire region, almost as a protectorate of the state of Israel. And important that Israel is demonstrating that they're willing to do that. Israel, as far as I'm concerned, should be willing to extend that kind of protection to any moderates in the region that are threatened by the enemies of Israel.
Do you think we'll see one day these Druze, in Syria, maybe making their way towards the Israeli border, trying to align themselves physically with the state of Israel if Israel does not extend or maintain a long-term presence in that buffer zone?
Well, I think we're moving to a point where you may see the borders of Syria change, right? That Syria may cease to be one country, that Iraq may at one point cease to be a singular country. These are all countries which were drawn by the British and the French after World War II. And it's the same situation you have in Jordan, where you had this Hashemite who was imported from Saudi Arabia to run Jordan. These are all the machinations of the British, the French, the international community after World War II. And they're proving themselves to be an utter disaster.
Right.
All these areas had enough time to moderate themselves, to get accommodated with those borders. But you see that the Middle East is really tribal. And you see that religious beliefs alter and differ. Even if the religions seem to an outsider to be close to one another, there's always differences, and there's differences between tribes. Even in Israel, when you look at the Palestinian Authority, you won't see a Palestinian from Hebron marrying a Palestinian from Shlem. It's tribal. And people have to understand that, and you have to draw the borders around tribal territories. You can't just draw like these mass borders, and you see now 70 years later, 80 years later, that these borders are all falling apart. So we're watching what Netanyahu has called changing the face of the entire Middle East. And as this change is taking place, and as old regimes like Bashar Assad fall, it is critical that Israel steps into those vacuums and demonstrates that it is the strong horse in the region.
Absolutely. And I want to turn back to the U.S.-Israel relationship here. We talked about a similar story several weeks ago, and this just broke over the weekend. The U.S. State Department told Congress on Friday that it plans to sell nearly $3 billion in weapons to Israel, including thousands of bombs and $295 million worth of armored bulldozers that had been held up by the previous administration, the Biden administration, over their so-called human rights concerns. The Trump administration is now fast-tracking these weapons to Israel. Just another example of the change, what we're seeing now, that the Trump administration is now, what are we in, 90 days in, 60 days in, whatever it is, just a whole different reality on the ground here.
Right, and this is happening in the backdrop of all the cuts that are being made. You see all of a sudden the United States saying U.S. aid is out.
Right.
They're cutting foreign aid to other countries. They're trying to balance the budget, not sending money anywhere, making all kind of cuts with this Doge agency, Elon Musk, and yet here Congress is saying that no, we're going to correct the what they consider to be the wrongs of the Biden administration and to fast track weapons to Israel. And you mentioned just how much is happening in a short period of time. I think it is critical that Israel recognize the momentum of the Trump administration right now and get on the bandwagon as fast as possible. You can see there's a lot of signals here, that Trump is well behind Israel, that the Republican-controlled Congress and Senate are right behind Israel, that he's meeting the hostages in the White House. He had a great meeting with Netanyahu. He's called for the emptying of the Gaza Strip. He said that He's cut off the aid to U.S. aid, which is putting a lot of money into all of Netanyahu's enemies and putting money into Gaza and elsewhere. They're fast-tracking weapons. They're giving heavier weapons that the Biden administration didn't want them to do. There's no guarantee how long this momentum is going to last.
That's for sure. I'll tell you where Israel does not want to be. Israel does not want to be in the shoes of the Ukrainians. And a lot of people by now probably saw the videos over the weekend, which looked nothing short of reality TV. I'm talking about the visit of Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky in the White House there with President Trump and Vice President Vance. I mean, just complete chaos there, a complete breakdown. I think at the end, Zelensky was essentially expelled from the White House, fighting publicly in front of the U.S. media. You had Vance versus Zelensky. You had President Trump jumping in. I mean, if you remember the Jerry Springer show, complete chaos in the White House there. And I want to break it down, especially how it relates to Israel and how different it was. You were at the White House. You were in meetings and press conferences between Prime Minister Netanyahu, and you saw the warm relationship that the Prime Minister had with Team Trump. And then you saw over the weekend how things got completely out of hand between the Ukrainian leader and President Trump and J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, and compare that between what you saw with Netanyahu and Zelensky. Just total chaos. I've never seen anything like this before.
I mean, no comparison. And I know that there's a lot of folks out there that really think that Israel and Ukraine are in similar positions, right? That Russia came in and attacked Ukraine, Hamas came in, backed by Iran, all the proxies, and attacked Israel, and that Israel and that Ukraine are on the same sort of trajectory. It's clear that President Trump does not see it that way, okay? He wants that war to come to an end. There's really good reasons to believe, seeing how many people have been killed, and this is something I said from the first minute of the war. I said that I think that Zelensky at the time was making a huge mistake, and that millions of people could die as a result of what happened. And they fought. And now Trump is saying, look, this isn't going to be an endless pit, right? The United States has given billions of dollars to Ukraine. But the more money they give to Ukraine to fight, it's not enough to prevent Russia from ending the war, right? So what the United States is doing, has done under the Biden administration, by giving more and more money, they are prolonging the war. And Trump wants to bring the war to conclusion. I think there's a big reason why there are differences between Trump's view on Israel and Israel's position versus Trump's view on Ukraine's position. Obviously, there's a religious component. There's that Judeo-Christian component. Trump's got all these faith leaders, and many of them are actually in Israel right now. Trump saying, he thinks he was saved by God when he averted the assassination attempts.
Right.
But there's another key, which is that Trump respects winners, okay? And what he understands about Zelensky is that Zelensky does not have the ability to win the war. That's the difference. He sees that Putin can maintain this war for as long as he wants. And if the United States continues to give money and weapons, one of two things is going to happen. Either the war is just going to prolong until infinity, some kind of war of attrition that's going to go throughout the 4 years of Trump's presidency, or the war is going to escalate. And that's the reason why Trump is saying that Zelensky is playing with World War III over here. And that's because Trump has talked to Putin, and he understands that Putin means business, and he's not willing to lose the war. So Trump understanding this position, that's why he's saying, Zelensky, you don't have the cards, right? Because he's not going to stop if I give you more money. The opposite. He's going to escalate. Trump wants it to end, and he wants to put the pressure, as you can see clearly, on Zelensky to end the war. And that's totally different than the situation in Israel, because Trump understands that Israel can win this war in its totality and can win it quick. And if the United States gives Netanyahu the money to do that, the weapons to do that, that Israel and the diplomatic backing, that Israel can end this war fast, and not only end it fast, but actually usher in a new era of peace, where all of a sudden on the flip side of this, you're going to see normalization agreements, not only with Saudi Arabia has been discussed, but possibly with Lebanon, possibly with Syria or some part of Syria, possibly with Egypt, that the entire region is going to change for peace by backing Israel. And that's, I think, the reason why you're seeing the difference here, but that's also the reason why Netanyahu and Israel should not be wasting a singular moment, right? Right now, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show, Israel, Witkoff proposing a new plan that would allow for hostages to come back over another period of 42 days. Why should Israel be wasting 42 days of the Trump presidency right now in the momentum that Trump is giving to Israel and to Netanyahu on a silver platter? Because perhaps, you can wait 6 weeks to defeat Gaza. Perhaps you could wait another 6 weeks to attack Iran. But we saw in the first presidency that Israel ran out of time with regards to expanding the Abraham Accords, right? That's why you didn't get a Saudi deal done. That's why Trump left the office of presidency saying there's as many as 5 other countries willing to extend these normalization agreements. Time is something that is of the essence right now, I think, for Netanyahu and for Israel. They should recognize, how short the amount of time they actually have to work with is and how much momentum they have to do something very, very big and do what Netanyahu said, which is change the face of the Middle East for decades to come.
I agree. No more excuses. Time is of the essence. By the way, Zelensky even got slack for the way he was dressed in the White House. He showed up in his, his tracksuit or whatnot. He even got railed by the Trump administration and people in the room. They're asking, why can't you put on a jacket? It was seen as a sign of disrespect by the Trump administration.
If you remember the first weeks of the war, you had these same ridiculous images of Netanyahu, Gantz, and Gallant, the 3 members of the war cabinet, also dressed in these black shirts, trying to be all cool like Zelensky. Netanyahu gave it up. Right.
It doesn't fly with President Trump. You don't play games like that.
Look,
the leader of the free world.
Leader of a state, you don't come in to meet the leader of the free world in your tactical gear. I mean,
right.
And Zelensky's also not on the front lines. He's a head of state also. So
everything makes a difference.
But the Biden administration, they were pushing that kind of stuff. They're trying to do this branding, brand Zelensky as a fighter, and then Israel also got into it, and it was a very weak look, I think. And Israel, I think, very wisely dropped it.
Yeah.
Zelensky now being taught a lesson by President Trump. I mean, it was a pretty ugly scene.
Yeah.
Trump said, it makes for great television. I don't know that it makes for great diplomacy. And we have to see now if that scene that Trump forced on Zelensky in the Oval Office will translate into Zelensky either reevaluating his position or doubling down. And so we could see on the one hand Zelensky giving in and a faster end to this conflict with Russia, which I think is really in everybody's interest at this point, or Zelensky could double down, look for security guarantees elsewhere from Europe and from Britain, as we already saw, that he had a conversation with Kyle Starmer of the UK and getting some kind of a guaranteed loan just to demonstrate that he's got other partners. But I think that if Zelensky doubles down over here, the situation could get a lot more dangerous.
We'll pay attention to that story as it develops. Just one last item here for you today, folks. There was an internal IDF probe released over the last several days in terms of the failures which led to the October 7th massacre. It's very, very complicated how it's broken down, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the first internal probe released. I'm sure we're going to see many of such probes in the days, weeks, and months ahead to try to determine exactly what happened leading to the October 7th massacre.
Well, I think we're beginning to see just how deep was the systemic failure. It was failure on every level. It wasn't only about what happened in the hours before October 7th. Now, if Israel had gotten it right just in the hours before October 7th, they probably could have prevented this massacre. But you see just how much buildup there was to this war, how deep were the tunnels, how many rockets were amassed, how sophisticated were the plans. And this is really about Israel from top to bottom. This includes the political spectrum. This includes the intelligence. This includes the military, all misunderstanding who Hamas is, misunderstanding their own level of deterrence, right? And really getting caught with their pants down on October 7th and causing a bloodbath, a massacre, a brutal massacre in Israel because they didn't understand who Hamas is. They didn't believe that Hamas could carry out the plans that Israel knew that Hamas had. They didn't understand how sophisticated were the plans, how deep the tunnel infrastructure was. They didn't understand the movements towards the border that were preceding October 7th, even before the hours right before October 7th massacre. So all of this, not listening to the guard posts,
right.
the women that were sitting there on he was surveilling what was going on. And it's systemic failure. It's top to bottom. And I know that what's happening here, and this ties into the questions is, will an official inquiry be issued? Will a state-run inquiry here examine what went wrong? Now, obviously, it's going to have to happen. And the longer it takes, in many ways, the worse it is. The reason why Netanyahu is delaying it is because he understands that probably Israel's Supreme Court is going to be the ones to oversee some kind of commission of inquiry. And if they do that, Netanyahu understands that the one that they're gunning to get to resign at the head of that all is Netanyahu himself, to the extent that he's worried. And I think that Netanyahu will, at a certain point, step out of the political realm here. But what you don't want to happen is a situation in which Netanyahu becomes the scapegoat at the head of everything, and that absolves everybody else underneath. That allows the heads of the intelligence, the heads of the military, all to stay in place because they blame the guy at the top, who's Netanyahu. The prime minister can only go with the information that he's getting. Right, the prime minister is not also the commander-in-chief of the military. That's the defense minister, that's the chief of staff. In many cases, they have just as much, if not more, authority to guide the military than the prime minister of Israel does. So, and not to mention that there wasn't necessarily the sense that the international community would permit Israel to go in and preempt something when it wasn't clear that Israel was going to be attacked. So in many ways, Israel got caught with its pants down, and now, as a result of that, is able to do what it should have done beforehand. And now we'll see, even if they get back to it in another round of offensive in the coming days.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is just the beginning, and this is going to drag on for many, many days, weeks, months, and maybe even years ahead. And we will keep you posted.
I can assure you, Netanyahu is not going to step down.
Oh, absolutely not. No doubt about it, for sure. He's survived many things politically, and he's not going to step aside, that's for sure. But that's all the time we have for today on this edition of Jerusalem Minute. Josh Hasten here, correspondent JNS News, along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Want to give a shout out to Ryan Lifshitz, Yuri Svritsky, Zach Sickerman, Timur David, Aklin, Avia Asner, and our newest member of the team, Esther Eden. Thank you all for everything you do behind the scenes.
Team's getting bigger.
Team's getting bigger, Alex. We're expanding. We're doing well here in JNS, huh? Have a great week, everybody. Continue to pray for our brave men and women of the IDF protecting us 24/7. Coming to you from the JNS Media Hub here in downtown Jerusalem. Have a great week, everybody. Shalom, shalom.